One of my jobs at Sunset is to provide public service announcements from time to time. And so I'd like to start with that. If I can get this back here. Please pay no attention. There we go. Charles, now is the time that we need to stop gang violence. Okay? This has to stop. Right? I mean, enough's enough. We have to draw the line somewhere. I really think that this would stand up in court. Don't you, Terry? I mean, it's a green vehicle, right? We got laughter from the kiddos back there. And finally, can we not get better camera footage at our bank teller machines? Right? We can get HD quality from Mars, but if you're trying to catch somebody who's stealing money, it's a little fuzzy, Mr. Bible. Okay, what does that have to do with our text today? Absolutely nothing. But I just thought it's always good for Christians to laugh, right? Because of all people on the earth, we are most to be joyful. We have the most hope. Today we talk about the fullness of time. But let me ask you a question. Are you a planner? Do you create lists? When you go to the grocery store, do you have a list that you cross off? Or do you just go up and down the aisle and throw whatever it is into the cart? Do you feel bad when you don't complete something? Are you impulsive? I'm going to suggest to you that our God is many things. He's a God of love. He's a God of mercy, of patience, kindness, faithfulness, steadfastness. But impulsive, He is not. Our God is a planner, a designer, a creator. He's a God of order. 1 Corinthians 14. An order that extended to His plan of salvation, including the time He sent Jesus to earth, born of a virgin, just at the right time and in the right place in history for that plan to come to fulfillment and the gospel to spread like wildfire. Our text is Galatians 4, but this is probably, for me, the saddest verse that we can run across. The Lord says, "Children I've reared and brought up, but they have rebelled against me." How is it, God says, that the ox knows its owner and the donkey its manger, but Israel does not know? My people do not understand. And so, hopefully today, maybe we can come to a better understanding of the plan that God put in place for the people at that time and for us. Galatians 4. Also in Ephesians 1, verses 9 and 10, but Galatians 4, 4 and 5, we don't want to ignore the last part of this verse, the part where God sent His Son to do what? To redeem us, to save us. But there are some verses in the Bible that make you scratch your head. So what did Paul mean, Brian, when he talked about the fullness of time or the fullness of the times? I want us today to consider 4 key elements that perhaps God put in place. Scholars have different opinions of this, and that's okay, but we're going to stick to the Bible and what we know about the Mediterranean world. It's 4 things, and you may see more, and if so, let's discuss them. I'd love to do that. But we have a brief period of time today. First, the Israelites. He worked through and with the Israelites to send Jesus to earth at just the right time. How so? Well, God tried over 1,000 years at least to instill His nature, who He was, what He expected from His people. In Genesis 12 and Genesis 22, didn't God tell Abraham, "It's through all nations that I will bless the people through your seed. I will bless all of them. 400 years later, He codified a covenant law for them, that He intended His people to be a city on a hill that others would look to as an example. And so officially with Moses, God had tried and tried and tried to instill in their hearts and in their minds purity and holiness and obedience, sacrifice, what sin was, discipline, even the importance of parenting, what to eat, what not to eat, how to take care of the poor, the oppressed, and on, the widow, the orphan. For the Israelites, God was one God in a polytheistic culture. He gave them the Old Testament. He gave them, and I think this is important because when we come to the second point, He gave them real stories through the law and the prophets, real stories of real historical accounts, epic accounts of mighty warriors who did wonderful, sometimes supernatural things. They were flawed, and along the way, He mixed in some really good poetry, didn't He? Through the wisdom literature and prophetic language that we don't find in too many other places. He talked about sin and the sacrificial system. This is important as we come to the New Testament, isn't it? The Israelites had to have a sense of what sacrifice for sin, to remove sin, was, even though the Hebrews writer and other New Testament writers tell us that that was insufficient. They had to get the idea that sin had to be taken care of to pave the way for Jesus. And like many Jewish leaders, Paul was a recipient of these teachings, was he not? Saul of Tarsus lived these. He self-described himself as a Hebrew of Hebrews. I was circumcised at the right time. I was raised the right way. He'd probably memorized the Torah. And he lived the life even to the point of killing people who did not, in his mind, follow that law. It guided his life every day. So in order to send Jesus in the fullness of time, it seems right to me and perhaps to us that God tried to instill something of His character into His chosen people through the law and the prophets to prepare them for the Messiah. I'm going to suggest this was not a coincidence, that this was part of God's plan. Secondly, the Gentiles. Did the Gentiles have the law? No. The Gentiles were not God's chosen people. How are you going to reach them? By the time of Jesus' birth, Greek ideas and Greek literature and Alexander the Great's influence permeated the Mediterranean region. And that was at a time when Jesus came to earth. The literate could all read Greek, including Paul. He obviously could. He wrote in it. He didn't just study the Torah. He knew the pagan literature. Just read his speech on Mars Hill in Acts 17 to know that he was very familiar with what the Greek poets wrote. And while the Greeks were religious and had a number of gods, they primarily focused on human reason, didn't they? This is about the man. This is about his mind. Even so much that some early Christian writers said, you know what? All this stuff coming from Athens, it's a bunch of bunk. Because it relies on human thinking. And even Tertullian would say, what has Athens to do with Jerusalem, buddy? We're going to forget about that and just focus on faith. Well, I'm going to suggest that there's a lot of value in knowing what was in that Greek literature, especially for us. Why? Because the gospel is inside of it. And I hope I can make that case. It was through the poetry of the Psalms and the prophets, as well as the more epic stories in the Old Testament that God reached the Jews. How was he to reach the Greeks? Through those same stories. Does it seem so unbelievable that God used the greatest poets and storytellers and prophets of Greece and Rome to prepare the hearts and minds of the pagans? I will tell you, if you don't know it, maybe you've been exposed to it, the Greek poetry and Greek histories and epics are full of little nuggets of stories that are very similar to the gospel story. And why would that be? I'm going to suggest that God put them there. Look at what Virgil wrote. Contrary to popular opinion, this is not Virgil Yoakum. This is the Roman poet Virgil, who lived around 40 BC. And look at what he wrote. By the way, there are hundreds of examples of this. This is just one of them. A new birth has been given. Justice returns, and a new progeny descends from heaven. The Greeks were very familiar with the idea of a God coming down and living, and a new time was to come. I pointed to Dionysus. Dionysus was, get this, Dionysus was, according to Greek legend, the son of Zeus, but had a mortal mother. Does that sound familiar? And Dionysus was killed. And what do you think happened after Dionysus was killed? He was raised to life. And so the Greeks were very familiar that they're kind of used to the idea of the story. These pagans were without the law, Romans 2, 1 Corinthians 9, cut off from direct revelation from God. How was he to reach them at their deepest levels of their being? Perhaps through their own law and their own prophets. Perhaps. There are many other references. C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien were at Oxford at the same time. Lewis knew the Greek myths. He knew the old Roman stories. And he said it's because of that he was an atheist. He said, to me, Christianity just seems like one of these myths. He said, I know these Greek myths are false. Until he talked to Tolkien. And Tolkien said, my friend, what if the reason that the story of Christ sounded so familiar to the pagan tales of divine births and God's dying and then rising from the dead was because Jesus was the myth that became true? And that's all C.S. Lewis needed. And for him, those ancient myths he loved were no longer a stumbling block to him. He came to view them as glimpses, as road signs, as pointers to a greater truth. And he said that for hundreds of years, we have these good dreams before Jesus came. He called them good dreams, scattered throughout the Greek tales about a God who dies and comes to life again, and by his death somehow has given life to us. I don't think that's a coincidence. The God who created us in the universe chose to reveal himself through a sacred story that, listen, it's a sacred story that resembles more the imaginative works of epic poets and tragedians, tragedy writers, than philosophers or religious people. And so the fullness of time had come for the Gentiles too. They were ready to accept the myth made fact. And oh, by the way, do you think it's a coincidence that God chose Paul to take the message to the Gentiles? I don't think so. Third, and unfortunately for many of our SIBI students, what Paul may have considered Koine Greek. Ron, you know this. By the first century, there were very few people, including a lot of Jews, who could actually read Hebrew. You know, they would speak and maybe read some Aramaic. But if you were literate, you could read Greek. It was all throughout the Mediterranean world, even the Romans. The Greeks, primarily through Alexander and his influence, had provided a language that was the most precise instrument for the conveyance of thought the world had ever known. It was common, and it was all over the Mediterranean. Koine Greek. The fourth and final one that I see, and again, maybe you'll see more, that is Latin. The Pax Romana is Latin for the Roman peace. In 44 BC, Julius Caesar is killed by the Roman Senate and his best friend Brutus. Julius Caesar has an adopted nephew called Octavian. Okay? After Julius Caesar dies, there's a triumvirate formed between Octavian and some other guy that I can't pronounce his name, and Mark Antony. And what happens when there's three rulers? They get along. Yeah, so there's civil war. They fight with each other. Octavian finally wins. He defeats Mark Antony and Cleopatra, who, by the way, Cleopatra was the last of the Greek Ptolemaic rulers in Egypt. And Octavian, the adopted nephew of Julius Caesar, wins. He takes over in 31 BC, right before the birth of Jesus. He ushered in what we know as the Pax Romana. Now, the Peace of Rome. This is important. I'm going to scroll through a few slides here, and they're going to be really fast. And the objective of this is not for you to read all these. Okay, buddy, don't write all these down. Okay? Amy, you don't need to know this for a test. Okay? But I'm going to scroll through these because I want you to see that really ever since time began, we've been fighting with each other over everything, and sometimes over nothing. But I'm just going to start at around 500 BC and show you all the battles and all the skirmishes and all the wars that I could find in the Mediterranean region. Oh, that's just the first page. And I thought this would scroll, but maybe it doesn't. Second one. And you've got Greece and Sparta and Macedonia and Rome and the Gauls and who we would later know as the Great Britain and Thebes and the Corinthians and Carthage. And we get down to right at the bottom, that's hard to see, 146 BC, Rome seizes Corinth and takes over for the Greeks. 146 BC, we keep going. Rome cleans house. They keep fighting with Carthage. Look what happens. This is about the time that Octavian takes over. You see that fourth line there that says, not much happening, right? What time period does that coincide with? Jesus' time. Okay, 11 BC to 43 AD, there's not much going on. Now, Rome is occupying, and they're kind of brutal, but they're keeping the peace. Octavian was also known as who? Caesar Augustus, who was emperor when Jesus was born. Okay, and again, maybe you do need to know this for a test, Amy. Caesar Augustus is responsible for the Pax Romana. He's the dude. Not much happening until around 60 AD. And then, of course, in 70, when Rome finally wipes out Jerusalem. Here's some things we got with the Roman peace. Rome comes in. They put roads all over the Mediterranean. They increase education. They build aqueducts. The water supply is better. They've got irrigation. They Augustus goes in and makes it illegal and pretty much takes out all these pirates that are menacing the Mediterranean region. How is that important for the first century and for the gospel to spread, do you think? And how about improved economic conditions? And there's a stable government and generally safe conditions and a sense of renewal. The Pax Romana. So you've got the Israelites, you have Greek and Roman myth. Do what? You have Koine Greek, and you have the peace of Rome. This was constructed in Rome in 9 BC to dedicate to Augustus the idea that he had brought peace to the country. The Ara Pacis, the altar to Augustine's peace. It's kind of cool. The fullness of time. Paul says, come in fullness of time. Now, I've listed 4 up here, okay? There might be 46. We probably don't have time to talk about the role John the Baptist played. Do you think he was important? He came and preached a baptism of what? Repentance for the forgiveness of sins. Right? Now, if you wanted to be a Jew, you'd have to be washed. But how were sins forgiven under the old law? John had to get the people ready, perhaps, for the idea of baptism through the forgiveness of sins. How about crucifixion? Do you think it was a coincidence that God sent Jesus at a time when crucifixion was as practiced as it was? How about He sent Jesus at a time when Israel was probably its weakest? Would they have been receptive to the gospel message if they were the big man on campus? If they were in charge of everything? Why do we need this guy? We don't need to be saved. What if there had been TV or the internet or audio-video recordings? Would our faith have increased, or would we have said, they just faked that? We've got pictures of the moon landing, okay? We've got pictures of it. We've got video of men walking on the moon, and yet what happened? That didn't happen. And so I think those could have been factors as well. When the fullness of time came, God sent forth His Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those under the law, that we might receive the full rights as sons. Okay, so what? This has been a nice history lesson, but who cares? So what about all this? Isn't it comforting to know that God loved us so much that He planned all this for us? That He put this in place? It wasn't just fly by your seat of the pants, impulsive, come what may actions. For me, maybe this even gives us more perspective on other verses in the Bible. I read John 3:16 a little bit differently now. For God so loved the world that He gave His only Son, that whoever believes in Him should not perish but have eternal life. Knowing some of the things God did for us at just the right time and in just the right place to redeem us from sin, and so the gospel could spread like it did and has, gives me even more confidence in a faithful God who I know will keep His promises forever and ever. God bless you all.